The Spanish Inquisition was not just a court, it was a machine of terror. A system built on fear, religious control, and brutal persecution. Established in 1478 by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, it was meant to enforce strict Catholic beliefs across their expanding kingdom, covering what is now modern-day Spain. But its true purpose ran deeper. It became a weapon, one used to root out, punish, and destroy anyone suspected of straying from the true faith. At first, its reach was narrow. The Inquisition set its sights on Conversos and Moriscos, Jews and Muslims forced to convert to Christianity. Many of these converts were accused of secretly practicing their old faiths in the shadows. But soon the Inquisition's grip tightened, spreading beyond Spain into Portugal, Mexico, and the far reaches of the Spanish colonies in South America. No one was safe. A whisper, an accusation, or even a personal vendetta could lead to arrest. Heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, even the smallest deviation from religious norms was enough to land someone in the hands of inquisitors. Over 3 centuries, nearly 150,000 people stood trial. Some were exiled, others were publicly humiliated, and many faced torture and execution, burned alive in the infamous auto da fe ceremonies. Their deaths meant to purify their souls. Even those who confessed were not always spared. What began as a mission to preserve Catholic purity spiraled into one of history's darkest chapters. But how did an institution designed to uphold faith turn into a force of fear and brutality? It all began with the first victims, the Conversos and the Moriscos. The Inquisition's origins trace back to the Reconquista, Spain's long struggle to reclaim its lands from Muslim rule. By 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella had finally conquered Granada, uniting Spain under Catholic rule. But their victory wasn't just political, they wanted religious unity too. They feared that Conversos, the Jewish converts, and Moriscos, the Muslim converts, were secretly holding on to their old faiths, threatening their vision of a purely Catholic Spain. Instead of seeking coexistence, they decided on a brutal solution. If conversion couldn't be trusted, then entire populations must be eradicated. Leading this charge was Tomás de Torquemada, a Dominican friar and Spain's first Grand Inquisitor. Obsessed with religious purity, he convinced the monarchs that only ruthless persecution could root out heresy. His influence was so great that he helped push the Alhambra Decree in 1492. This notorious decree forced all Jews in Spain to choose between conversion, exile, or death. Overnight, families were shattered, businesses collapsed, and entire communities were forced onto ships, fleeing to North Africa, Portugal, and Italy. Those who stayed and converted were still not safe. The Inquisition's shadow loomed over them, ready to strike at the first hint of a Jewish prayer or ritual. Their homes were watched, their neighbors were encouraged to report them, and even the smallest slip, like a refusal to eat pork or the lighting of candles on a Friday night, could bring the wrath of the Inquisition to their very front door. The paranoia didn't stop there. Muslims, too, faced suspicion. Though initially allowed to stay, the Moriscos, or the Muslims who had converted to Christianity, were soon seen as a threat. By the early 1600s, they were subjected to mass expulsions. In 1609, King Philip III, urged by his advisor and the fanatical Archbishop of Valencia Juan de Ribera, ordered their expulsion. He passed an edict that ordered the Moriscos to depart under the pain of death and confiscation without trial or sentence, to take with them no money, bullion, jewels, or bills of exchange, just what they could carry. Many had lived in Spain for generations, but it made no difference. Those who remained were hunted by the Inquisition, seized from their homes, and forced into interrogation chambers, where torture awaited anyone suspected of secretly practicing Islam. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond religious heresy. It also sought out the unseen, the unnatural, the imagined. Among its many victims were those accused of witchcraft and superstitious practices, charges often built on fear, whispers, and paranoia. Nowhere was this more evident than in 1610, in the quiet village of Zugarramurdi, Navarre. It began with rumors, dark rituals, strange gatherings. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and soon, accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire. The Inquisition responded with merciless force, In a public auto da fe in Logroño, 6 people were burned alive. Another 5, who had either escaped or perished before trial, were sentenced to death in effigy, their names forever marked as heretics. The message was clear: defy religious norms and you will burn. Yet not everyone within the Inquisition believed in witches. Alonso de Salazar Frias, an inquisitor sent to investigate the trials, made a chilling realization. There were neither witches nor bewitched in a village until they were talked and written about. In other words, the Inquisition was fighting enemies that didn't exist. Fear itself had created the witches, and once the hysteria took hold, no one was safe. But heretics and witches weren't the only ones hunted down by the Inquisition. The war on sin ran even deeper, into the most intimate aspects of human life. Next, the Inquisition would turn its gaze toward unnatural desires. In 1524, Pope Clement VII granted the Spanish Inquisition yet another power, the authority to prosecute sodomy cases in Aragon. With that decree, a new wave of persecution began, one that reached into the most private corners of people's lives. The first known execution under this law came in 1541, when a priest named Salvador Vidal was burned at the stake. He was just one of many. Others faced brutal fates, public whippings, crippling fines, and years of backbreaking labor on galleys, rowing until their bodies gave out. But the crime of sodomy was not what we think of today. To the Inquisition, it was a broad and damning term. It encompassed not only same-sex relationships, but also interrupted intercourse and even certain acts between married couples. Any deviation from procreative sex was considered a sin against nature, a crime punishable by humiliation, torture, or death. And once accused, few had any hope of escaping the Inquisition's grasp. But while its rulings were harsh, its methods were even crueler. The machinery of the Inquisition was not just built to judge, it was built to break. And soon, we step inside the darkest chambers of its power. When the Inquisition arrived in a city, it didn't kick down doors immediately. It started with persuasion. Accusation began with an edict of grace, a public announcement at Sunday Mass listing possible heresies and inviting people to confess within a limited time. Those who came forward were promised leniency. But after 1500, these were replaced by edicts of faith, which skipped the grace period and simply encouraged people to report others. And report they did. Since denunciations were anonymous, anyone could accuse anyone else, out of fear, personal vendetta, or sheer opportunism. Neighbors, friends, and even family members turned on each other, knowing that a single whispered word could mean doom. Society became a breeding ground for paranoia, where no one was safe from suspicion. Once accused, a person's fate rested in the hands of calificadores, religious officials who decided whether the case was worth pursuing. Many were imprisoned indefinitely, sometimes for years before even learning what they were charged with. Their property was seized to fund their own imprisonment, leaving families in financial ruin. Prisoners were kept in isolation. No visits, no sacraments, no information. When trials finally took place, they were never about justice. The accused was assigned a lawyer, but his role was not to defend, it was to convince them to confess. If he suspected guilt or simply feared for his own safety, he was obligated to abandon the case altogether. Worse still, the accused was never told who had turned them in. They were left to fight against invisible enemies, fabricated accusations, and a system designed for their downfall. And if the evidence wasn't strong enough, there was always torture. The Inquisition had many ways to extract the answers it wanted, but few were as excruciating as the Garrucha. Among the most gruesome methods of torture used by the Inquisition was the strapado, also known as reverse hanging. It was a method designed not to kill quickly, but to stretch pain to its very limits. The victim's hands were bound behind their back, and a rope was secured around their waist. They were then hoisted into the air by their wrists, leaving their body to dangle in an unnatural position. The weight of their own body became the instrument of their suffering. At first, the pain was excruciating, but as time passed, it became unbearable. Slowly, the force would begin tearing their shoulders from their sockets, nerves would snap, and in the worst cases, bones would shatter. But the inquisitors did not seek death. At least not yet. Their goal was to break the mind before the body failed. To heighten the agony, some victims were suddenly dropped and caught mid-air, the violent jolt intensifying their suffering. If their will had not already shattered, their body would eventually force them to surrender. But the strappado was only one of the many ways the Inquisition twisted pain into obedience. If this method failed, there was another, one that stretched the human body past its limits. Next, we turn to El Potro, the rack. Another method of torture was to use the rack. Imagine being dragged into a cold, candlelit chamber, your wrists and ankles roughly bound in iron shackles. You're forced onto the rack, a long wooden table with rollers at both ends. The Inquisitor watches, expressionless, as his assistant turns the handle. At first, it's just pressure, a tight pull on your limbs. But then, snap. Your shoulders pop from their sockets. Your knees crack. The pain is unbearable, but the wheels keep turning. Ligaments tear, bones grind, and if the torturer keeps going, your arms and legs will rip clean off. But they rarely let it get that far. After all, a corpse can't confess. If the rack alone doesn't break you, they have other tools, red-hot pincers, thumbscrews, spiked boots, ready to carve fresh screams from your throat. Even those who resisted at first rarely held out for long. Sometimes just witnessing someone else on the rack was enough to make the strongest souls beg for mercy, confessing to crimes they never committed, just to make it stop. But for many, confession didn't mean freedom. It only meant the next stage of their suffering. Another brutal method of torture was waterboarding, or what was known at the time as interrogatorio mejorado del agua, or la toca. In this, the victim was restrained, and a cloth was placed over their mouth and nose. Then water was slowly poured over the cloth, forcing them to inhale liquid instead of air. The sensation was agonizingly close to drowning, triggering sheer panic as their lungs burned for oxygen. Though the Inquisitors were careful not to kill their victims outright, the experience was so excruciating that most begged for mercy long before the water stopped flowing. The method wasn't designed to leave visible wounds, but the psychological terror it inflicted was as scarring as any blade or flame. The heretic's fork was a simple yet horrifying device, used to ensure that accused heretics remained silent, both literally and metaphorically. It was a metal rod with sharp prongs on both ends, designed to be strapped between the victim's chin and chest, or between their neck and upper chest. The purpose? To prevent them from speaking, moving their head, or even resting. Once secured, any attempt to lower the head or relax would drive the sharp points into the skin, causing extreme pain. Victims were often forced to wear the device for extended periods, sometimes days, ensuring that they remained in a state of constant exhaustion and agony. The heretic's fork was particularly effective at preventing people from recanting their confessions or speaking out against their accusers. Adding to the psychological terror, some versions of the device were inscribed with phrases like "I recant" or "I renounce," reinforcing the idea that their suffering was a consequence of their supposed sins. The Inquisition was not just about physical torment, it was about breaking the will. But did these brutal methods always succeed in extracting confessions? The answer is no. Even the Inquisitors themselves acknowledged that torture was unreliable. The official stance was that any confession given under interrogation was true and not a result of coercion. But in reality, victims knew the consequences of recanting. To take back their words was to invite a second round of agony. As author Cullen Murphy noted, under such conditions, people will say anything just to make the pain stop. No one was safe from the Inquisition's tactics, not even members of the clergy. Bernard de Lisieux, a Franciscan friar, was tortured so severely that he nearly died from his injuries. He would later remark that even St. Peter and St. Paul could have been forced to confess to heresy under such torment. Once the interrogations ended, the accused faced their final judgment. A panel of theologians and legal scholars gathered in what was called the consulta de fe, or faith consultation. Their task was to review the case, vote on a verdict, and issue a sentence. If there was any disagreement, it was escalated to the Suprema, the highest authority of the Inquisition. Decisions were made carefully, deliberately. But for those accused, that offered little comfort, because once a judgment was passed, their fate was sealed, and in many cases it led to the most feared spectacle of all, the auto da fe. Then came the auto da fe, or act of faith, which was one of the most theatrical and chilling rituals of the Spanish Inquisition. It was not merely a trial or an execution, it was a grand public spectacle, carefully staged to remind everyone of the Church's absolute power. Those condemned by the Inquisition were paraded through the streets, dressed in penitential robes called the sanbenitos, while onlookers, often in the thousands, gathered in the city's largest plaza. The event began with a solemn Catholic Mass, prayers, and a reading of the sentences, all under the watchful eyes of both religious and royal officials. While the executions themselves did not take place during the ceremony, everyone knew what was coming. Those found guilty of heresy, witchcraft, or secretly practicing forbidden faiths would later face their fate, often the flames of the stake. Over time, these events became grandiose and macabre spectacles, drawing massive crowds who treated them as both a warning and a form of entertainment. The last public auto da fe took place in 1691, but by then, the ritual had already cemented itself as one of the most infamous displays of religious persecution in history. Then came the auto da fe, or act of faith, not just a trial, not just an execution, but a theatrical display of terror. The Spanish Inquisition didn't just punish its victims, it paraded them. Those condemned were marched through the streets dressed in sanbenitos, penitential robes meant to mark them as sinners. Thousands gathered in the city's largest plaza, watching as the accused were led to their final humiliation. The ritual began with a solemn Catholic Mass. Prayers were spoken, sentences were read aloud, and the Church's authority loomed over every word. Religious and royal officials sat in judgment, ensuring the message was clear. There was no salvation outside the faith. The executions did not happen during the ceremony, but everyone knew what was coming. Those found guilty of heresy, witchcraft, or secretly practicing forbidden faiths would soon meet their fate, often in the flames of the stake. The Inquisition's deadliest punishment became a public spectacle, where fear and entertainment blurred into one. By the late 1600s, these macabre gatherings had grown into massive, almost theatrical events. The last public auto da fe took place in 1691, but by then, the ritual had already etched itself into history as one of the most chilling displays of religious persecution ever witnessed. But even the most powerful institutions do not last forever. The world was changing, and the Inquisition, once feared, once untouchable, was beginning to rot from within. Its slow death had begun. What do you think? Could you have endured the Inquisition's brutal torture? Do you believe confessions extracted under such agony had any real truth to them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you're fascinated by dark and nefarious stories from history, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always more to uncover, and you won't want to miss what comes next.